Okay, so it's important that when you think of English, when you think of sentences in English, that you think that everything is made up of small bits. It's just like, just like anything. Like a building is made up of small bricks. A brick is a very simple idea. Okay, but when you put bricks together in certain structures and then you build on top of that and you add that bit, you end up with big, complicated and complex structures. Well, I think of that. I think of sentence structure the same. And in fact, I think of English like that. It's not, it's not magic. All right. It's always the simple foundational things which come together and make complicated bits. So I'm going to spend a few minutes at the beginning of class today just talking about the way that I think that you should think about sentences. All right. And I think that this is helpful for writing, but it's also helpful for reading. All right. So we'll have a little look at what I mean by sentence structure. And then we'll introduce some causes today. And over this week, let's see how we go. But I think that we probably can do causes and results and contrast this week. And who knows, we might even be able to do some listing as we get towards the end of the week. Now, it's possible that some of you have studied this before, even studied it with us before, but it's always good to repeat and review and revise, because grammar's like a muscle. If you don't use it, it will go. All right. So let me open up my study document, which is here. Yeah. Okay. So let's zoom in. And I'm going to, I know this is going to sound very, very basic, some of the stuff I'm saying now, but it's important for us to get the foundation right. Okay, so first of all, when we're thinking about sentences, long sentences and sentences with multiple ideas in, you've always got to think about the relationship between the ideas. So I'll write something for you and you tell me what you think. Okay. Oops. What do you think about that? Are you happy with that sentence?
No, it's illogical.
It's illogical, isn't it? But it's perfectly written.
Yeah.
Perfectly written.
Perfect grammar.
Yeah, the grammar's really, really nice. But I just say, first of all, forget about that. The first thing is you've got to have a good idea. You've got to have something that makes sense. That doesn't make any sense. Your hunger is not affected by how many hands you've got. All right. So that is not logical. All right. So that's the first thing. Don't write things which are completely illogical. Everybody, if you were in your own language, you'd be making good choices, you'd think, good grammar, using the right linker, etc. But when you're under pressure in the exam, and you've seen this if you've been in any of our writing weeks, sometimes people write things that are either not true or don't really make sense. And it's not always purely because of the grammar that they make a grammar mistake. Sometimes they're under pressure and they've just said something that's wrong, that's illogical, that isn't an accurate representation of the situation. And make sure you use the correct linker. Okay, now in this case, there's absolutely no connection. But what about if it was this one? What if you said something like this? Now, this one for me is a little bit different. Paul was hungry, and as a result, he didn't have breakfast. Now, everyone's thinking the same thing. That's not logical. Okay. But if you were the examiner, okay, if you're the examiner, if you're me, if you're the English teacher, you're thinking, actually, that one's a lot closer than this one. Because this one, there is absolutely no connection between number of hands and hunger. There's none. So it doesn't matter what linker you use. Okay, you could have used, although he had, you could have said, due to having two hands, Paul was hungry. It doesn't matter. You could put any linker in that sentence and it just would not make any sense. But this one, actually, there is a relationship, aren't they? Being hungry and eating breakfast. They do make sense. Even more, being hungry and not eating breakfast, you know that there's a connection between those two things. But what's happened here is that it's actually the incorrect linker, or it's the wrong way round. As Farouk said, it's the opposite. Okay. Now, here, really what you should be thinking is maybe because. What do you think about that? What if
Yes.
because
Due
or due to, yeah. But because would work perfectly, wouldn't it? There it is. So use the right linker. Okay. That's not the right linker, but we want to use the right linker. Okay. So oops, let's push this down here. So let's put that sentence again, and we can put that like that. You know what else I'm going to do, guys? I don't like this font. We'll take the bold off. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so this should be because. And that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to introduce this idea of cause linkers today. So this one, not correct. That one introduces results. This one introduces causes. And that's good, but we don't want a comma there. Okay, so that's the first thing. I know we should understand this without saying it, but we'll see, guys. We will see when we do some practice. We'll see that there will be some people and some sentences that don't make sense. Okay, and it will be because people have chosen the wrong linker. Okay, so let's push this down here then. All right, okay. Now the next thing we need to understand is what a clause is. Now, in these sentences here, I think of these as clauses. Okay, and they are clauses. A clause is a section of a sentence that contains a verb phrase. That's what a clause is. Now, notice that I'm saying a verb phrase and not subject verb, because it can be object, but it could be object verb, it could be passive. So a verb phrase is where you've got a noun and an action. Okay, so Paul ate, Paul didn't eat, Paul was hit, the hospital was opened. Okay, all of these are verb phrases. A noun that's either a subject or an object does a verb, does an action. Okay, but I'm going to say over this week as well that I've invented my own phrase. Okay, and it's a noun clause. So can anyone see a noun clause on the page? Something that I would call a noun clause.
Yes.
Where would you put that, Farid?
A clause is a section before a clause. This is a noun.
No.
Might having two hands.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
So technically, that's just a noun. That's what that is. It's just a noun phrase, which we've done before. But I would say, just for the purposes of understanding sentence structure, let's call these noun clauses, because if I wrote this another way, if I wrote this with although, you'd do this, wouldn't you? Although Paul had two hands, Paul was hungry. That's what you do if you used although. You'd then make two verb clauses. So for me, I think it's easier for us all if we say, well, after certain phrases, which we'll look at, you have to use a noun. Why don't we call this a noun clause? And that's a verb clause. And then what we're saying is that then we know that there are two sections to the sentence, and it's not just noun phrase. We'll call it a noun clause. That's what I'm going to refer to it as. Okay. But yes, Farid?
In the noun clause, shouldn't be there verb, because phrase is only without. I know
that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Normally in a clause, it would have a verb phrase. That is exactly what a clause is. But just for the interests of us trying to understand sentence structure, I'm just going to refer to it as a noun clause, because ultimately we're taking verb clauses and converting them into nouns. It's easier to think of it as two clauses, I think. I think that's an easier way to think of it. Okay. So this is the basic idea, but an even more basic idea. This is the reason why I think that this is a good way to think of it is I want you to think of things in terms of ideas. Okay. So if you think Paul was hungry, that for me is an idea. He didn't have breakfast. That's an idea. He didn't have. That's not an idea for me because it's not a complete idea. Okay. In this one, having two hands, we know it was Paul that had two hands. Okay. Paul was hungry. It was Paul. That's an idea. So I think of this as an idea. I think of this as an idea. So when we're talking about making sentences more complicated and longer, well, what's the reason for that? Take a step all the way back. You could say that every single sentence that you use is just like this. Okay. You could do that if you wanted. Every single sentence that you do could just have one idea in. But that's not what we do, is it? We don't. We all use linkers. We want to use linkers in OET. In the reading, they will be doing this a lot. Okay. So for me, it's a good idea to think of sentences as, well, they are devices for us to show ideas. And in English, if you want to show more than one idea in a sentence, there are reasons for that. It starts with, first of all, the relationship's got to be a logical thing. You can't say like, last night I ate bananas and the moon is in the sky. Nobody does that. Nobody puts those two things together in a sentence. Grammatically, it's fine, but nobody does it. So it starts with, what am I really trying to say? How many ideas are there that I'm really trying to connect together? How do they connect? Is it just, am I just adding a piece of information to this sentence? Am I showing that this one caused that one? Am I showing that those two are surprising, that they both exist together using contrast? So that's what we should be thinking. When we want to add ideas together, first of all, is it a good connection? Secondly, how do I do that? In English, you can't just do this. We have loads of Spanish and Italian speakers who just seem to do this. They just put commas in and just continue with a new idea. In English, you can't do that. In English, you've got to have a license to add new information in, and those licenses are linkers, the use of relative clauses and participle clauses with commas, sometimes prepositional phrases. Okay, that's how we add them together. So in general, in OET, it's going to be addition, so using listing or and. We're going to do causes, we're going to do results, contrast, relative clauses, and participle clauses. They're basically the way that you're going to express yourself in OET writing. Carolina, have you got a question?
Yes, very, very short one. About punctuation, using a comma before the preposition and, because I was taught that it is always need a comma before and when listing, but when some of my writings were corrected, teachers get rid of the comma.
A comma only goes before and if it's necessary, and that comma can really make a big difference. It's called an Oxford comma. So if you said something like this, it's hard to think of examples of Oxford commas when you're think of a panda. Okay, do you know what panda is?
A bear, no?
Yeah. So
Panda bear.
So a panda eats, shoots and leaves. Okay, Shoots are little bits of at the youngest part of a plant. You know, when it first starts growing through the soil, that's called a shoot. Okay, but it's also a verb, isn't it? Okay, a cowboy shoots and leaves. That's a different thing, isn't it? So if you look at this, if you say a panda eats, shoots and leaves, you're saying that they eat. And what do they eat? They eat this and they eat that. Is that okay?
Yes, perfectly understood.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
listing.
But now, if it's a cowboy, now what does a cowboy do? A cowboy doesn't eat shoots and leaves, does it? A
No.
cowboy has a gun. So what does the cowboy do? The cowboy eats, shoots, and leaves. Okay. Now it's starting to get a bit different, isn't it? Because of the comma. All right. Now, what if it was something like this? A panda eats, shoots, and leaves a mess on the floor. Okay. Now it's starting to get a bit.
It
It's starting
becomes
to
a
get a bit
verb.
strange, isn't it? So now you're thinking, well, I should put a comma there. Because now you're introducing a new verb clause. But it could be confusing to someone. It could be they eat, shoots, and leaves. Ah, right. It's a bit different. So the comma does make a difference, but you don't need it in a normal list. It's very rare that we use it's called the Oxford comma. Very rare that we do it. And that's why it's also not a big problem. If you put one in, I don't care really. It doesn't normally make a difference. The punctuation and grammar errors that I care about are ones that change meaning. It won't change a meaning very often. Okay. Do all sorry, yeah. And can a sentence have a number of clauses? There's no limit to the number of clauses that a sentence can have. There's no limit. But for me personally, I think limit yourself. I don't really ever try and say more than 3 things in a sentence. That's just my style. And there's a power. Is it true? Is it true in every language? There's a power of 3.
Yeah, it's like norm, but not listing more than 3 different nouns, for example.
Yeah.
But it's
Well,
in listing.
not just in terms of listing, but listing 3 things. Like if you were going to praise somebody, you not often say 3 things. It just sounds that in English anyway, it's got this kind of, he did this, and that. It just sounds powerful. It's got a kind of rhythm to it, which makes people remember it better.
Yes, that's we have the same thing.
Yeah, I imagine it's
Yes, that's true.
I think it's just humans, isn't it? I like that. So for me, I think that most non-native writers have got perfectly capable of controlling a sentence with 3 ideas in. But if you start doing 4 ideas, it starts to get a little bit messy, and you're starting to think, okay, well, did the list begin with a verb pattern? That affects things later on. Has someone used a linker that requires a noun after it? And if they don't recognize that, then it's a problem. And if they did do it, well, maybe the first verb goes quite well, and then they put a relative clause in, and then they forget that they started this with a linker that needs a noun after it. It starts to get a little bit long and difficult to do. Imagine a long operation's more complicated and more difficult to remember what happened earlier than a short operation. It's the same kind of thing. So a clause is a section of a sentence that contains a verb phrase. And I think it's useful to think that that a clause contains an idea. How many things are we really trying to say here? Why did I decide to include this thing in as well? Do I think that's an important idea? Well, if so, I need to add it to the sentence using some kind of license. That's what I call it, a license. And sometimes I see sentences that just look like this. Paul ate a banana. He lives in Manchester. Okay. You can't just put that comma there. You might think, well, there are other times I see commas in the middle of sentences. Yeah. Although Paul lives in Manchester, he works in Huddersfield. Okay, yeah. You could say, well, what's the difference between this comma and that one? They look just the same. They're both after a verb phrase, and they both are followed by this, which he lives in Manchester, he works in Huddersfield. They're really similar. But the thing is, this one starts with although, and although is our license to add things together, even though it's not there in between the two things. It doesn't have to be. It can be at the beginning. It could also be in the middle. Okay. Paul works in Huddersfield. Oops. Huddersfield, although he lives in Manchester. So there are times you can put them in the middle. All right, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's not 100% obvious why you can put a comma in the middle of two clauses in one sentence, but you can't in another. But there will always be a license like this. And that's what we need to practice. Okay, that's what we're going to do. Okay, so next, noun clauses and verb clauses. Okay. As I said earlier, I call them noun clauses, but there are some linkers. Okay, the linker determines whether you use a noun clause. I'm putting this in inverted commas because they're not really called that, or a verb clause. All right, it's the linker that determines it, not just if you feel like it. All right, and when you first start learning linkers, you're not always aware. But there are some linkers that everyone seems to be aware of, and some linkers that you've used all the way along in your journey of learning English. So it's very rare that anyone makes mistakes with and or because. It's very, very rare. People don't make mistakes with so very often. Okay, there are just some, or but. Nobody makes mistakes with but. But there are other linkers that people do make mistakes with, like despite or due to. Earlier on, Carolina suggested you could just put due to in there, but you couldn't just put due to in there. If you put due to in there, it's actually something that you have, maybe you haven't done before. It would have to be due to him not having. And that's a bit different, isn't it? You can't just slot due to in there. So certain phrases like due to and despite and in spite of and in addition to, okay, these are just a few of them. They require you to use nouns. You can't just put the nice simple grammar. But and because are just, they're great. We've learned those. We don't even remember learning them. I bet nobody here can remember learning those phrases. They've been in your head for years, and you don't make mistakes because you hear people using them all the time. If you watch a TED talk, they'll say because and but many times. If you listen to OET, they'll say because and but many times. If you go out in the street, or if you work, or if you order something in a restaurant, there'll be because, there'll be but. And they are perfect because they're always in the middle of two verb clauses. That's why they're so easy to use. I like chocolate, but I don't eat it very often. Okay, it's in the middle of two verb clauses. I don't eat it very often. I like chocolate. There it is. Really, really simple. You don't make mistakes with it. But we do make mistakes with despite. Okay, you can't just put despite in the middle there. That doesn't work. You have to turn that second clause that follows despite, or any clause that follows despite, whether it's at the beginning or in the middle, you have to change it. And it becomes something different. It becomes something like this. Okay. Oops. something like that. But to be honest, I wouldn't be using despite this way. There's another way to do it, which changes the meaning somewhat. Okay, you'd probably do this. Despite liking chocolate, comma, I don't eat it very often. That's probably what you would do instead. It's a slightly different meaning, which is another aspect of contrast that we need to be aware of. But you can understand why nobody makes mistakes with but people do make mistakes with despite. It can move around to different places in the sentence, and you have to follow it with a noun. So that's where it starts to get a bit tricky. But you've all learned so many more complicated things than this in your life. You just have to practice this to memorize it. And after a while, all of these kinds of linkers will feel the same as but. And it will feel wrong to say, I like chocolate despite I don't eat it very often. It will feel wrong like it does when you say, I like chocolate, but I am not eating it. Oh, sorry, but not eating it very often. That would be weird, wouldn't it? I like chocolate, but not eating it very often. That just feels completely wrong, doesn't it? No one likes that. Okay, you need to get to that point of familiarity with the other linkers, and that's what we'll do this week. We'll practice it. All right. Now, one last thing is this, and this is going to seem really. You might think, why is Paul telling us about the verb to be now? But it's important. Okay, think about how we use the verb to be. Can anyone give me any examples of how we use the verb to be?
With linkers?
Yeah, it's a verb. So yeah, we use it with linkers.
So although, for example, although being in the party.
Well, that doesn't work because although is not followed by a noun clause. Just in general, how do we use the verb to be? What do we use it?
Although I
In continuous.
Forget linkers. Forget linkers.
okay, he
Continuous. Continuous.
yes,
Continuous, yeah.
I am
he
there.
is going to school.
He is
Passive.
going to school. Yeah. Yeah. Passive. Yeah. I was hit by a bus. That's always my example. That never happened to me,
And
guys.
also states her, for example, she is a doctor.
She is a doctor. Well, then it's just a normal verb, isn't it? She is a
Yeah.
doctor. Yeah, okay, yeah. We're just stating something. Yes, she is a doctor. Yeah. And there's another one. And this is one that causes problems. What was that?
Participle clause. For example, being a mother of
Yeah.
5.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Present participle clauses. Yeah, participle clauses. We could do that in, yeah.
Could be
But-
being a mother, it's difficult for her to
Ah.
do night shift.
Carolina, you just did it without even thinking about it. Okay, you just did a participle clause. If you think about it really, Mary, that's just this, isn't it? It's just state, but in a participle form.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not going to take that one away, but Carolina, you just did it. Being a mother
Being
is
a mother,
it
it's
is
difficult. It is difficult for her to do night shift.
what type of word is difficult?
Verb is not difficult. Difficult is not verb.
No, but what type of word is it?
It's an adjective.
An adjective. We also introduce adjectives with the verb to be, don't we? Okay.
Yes.
It
Yes.
is
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Sometimes noun.
I am happy. Okay. So this is the problem. All right. When we turn things into nouns, this doesn't matter. Okay. This doesn't matter because nouns don't have tense, do they? So continuous goes out of the window. That's not important. But, and this one doesn't matter as well because it's a verb. All right. But here we have a problem. These two things get mixed up all the time. And when it comes to noun clauses, you say something like this. What could I do? Yeah, but an example I often use, he was rich, but he was unhappy. So we'll talk more about contrast later in the week. This is a type of indirect contrast.